A while back, I released a full walkthrough on setting up Next.js Authentication with Amazon Cognito. But a lot has changed since then. Amplify has moved to version 2, which pushed developers deeper into AWS ecosystem. Next.js introduced the app router, server components, and server actions. In short, it's time for an updated guide. So, in this video, we're building the entire Cognito authentication flow from scratch. But this time, instead of Amplify, we're using Better Auth, a framework-agnostic Auth library that works not only with Next.js, but also with React Router, 10-stack app, and even Express. On the Cognito side, we'll use the new Managed UI, the evolution of Hosted UI, which gives us sign-up, email, verification, password resets, multi-factor authentication, and more right out of the box. We will also dive into granular access level controls using access token scopes. And finally, we'll use the AWS JavaScript SDK inside the server actions to update user information and keep it perfectly in sync with the session. And if at any point the code feels overwhelming, don't worry, I've linked complete guides for Node.js and JavaScript in the description. Whether you are getting started or leveling up, they'll help you fill in any gaps as you follow along. I am in Visual Studio Code in a simple Next.js project that will be a starting point for our application. Let me walk you through it real quick. So if we open src folder and app folder, it's a Next.js app router app. So we have a page.tsx file, and this is the landing page. And our project is called Task Manager. And here we have a link, Get Started. When users click on that link, they're redirected to the dashboard page. So this is basically a simple dashboard page that says, hey, welcome. And it has a fake data for like total tasks and completed tasks. And then from that page, you can also go to the tasks page, also kind of fake page right here. It says manage your tasks here, and it basically doesn't have any tasks, and I have a link back to the dashboard. Also, both tasks and the dashboard, they share the layout, and this layout is basically a top navigation that has just links to the tasks, and then it also have a kind of icon for the user and a drop down where user can click and log out. As usual, the link to all the code for this video will be in the description below. Let's go ahead and spin up a dev server with npm run dev, and we'll see how this app looks in the browser. And if we switch to the browser on the localhost 3000, we have our app. We click on Get Started, we redirect it to dashboard. We can go to tasks page, and then we can also click right here and click log out. So this application obviously doesn't have any authentication, so user can easily go to dashboard. Our goal here is to build authentication for this application using Cognito Identity Provider and Better Auth library to do the heavy lifting for us. So let's go and check out documentation for Better Auth, and you can find it at better-auth.com. So they build themselves as the most comprehensive authentication framework for TypeScript, and it is framework agnostic, so it supports popular frameworks. It supports Next.js in our case. It has email and password authentication, multiple auth providers. In our case, we're going to be using Cognito. It supports multi-factor authentication. We're not going to use that, though. We're going to use multi-factor authentication that is built in with a Cognito. And you can use organizations, and it has a rich blogging ecosystem. Let's go ahead and jump into the actual docs. Here, important sections are installation, that explains how to install Better Auth and how to basically configure it. They also talk about it in the basic usage section. Next, we have concepts, and the most important is actually database. Although Better Auth supports different types of authentication, it essentially uses a session-based mechanism. So it creates sessions in a database, and then it uses the session ID and stores it in the cookie in the browser, and that's how it references the session. Better Auth supports a lot of database adapters. Here in the database section, you can see supports MySQL, SQLite, Postgres, MS SQL. It also supports different ORMs like Drizzle or Prisma, and it also supports MongoDB, which we are going to be using. The database documentation has a section about running migrations. However, in our case, we won't need this because we're using MongoDB. It also talks about secondary storage, where you can have Redis to store your session data, rate limiting, counters, and other stuff. And the most important here is the core schema, right? It uses user table, or in our case, it's going to be a user model in MongoDB, or user document. It has ID, name, email, email verified, image and created at, updated at. Those are default fields. It has a session, table or a document, account, and then verification. So verification will be used when you're doing the Auth 2.0 authentication, where you need to exchange the code for the tokens, access tokens and ID tokens. The next concept that you want to check out right here is the sessions. Right, it's also very important, right? It tells you again about the session table, the session expiration, how to disable session refresh, and session management. Finally, since we're going to be using Cognito authentication, which is a type of Auth, so you're going to check out Auth section in the documentation, and it tells you how to use it, how to log in, link account, get access token, and other stuff. And Better Auth supports not only Cognito but many other Auth providers, including the generic one. And finally, here on the authentication, if you open it up, you can see that it has a lot of social logins here. In our case, we're interested in Cognito, so we'll be referencing this documentation. So let's go ahead and configure Cognito in our application. In the SRC folder, we're going to go ahead and create another folder called Lib, that stands for library. And in that folder, we're going to create auth.cs file. Before we actually create any code in this file, let's go ahead and install the libraries that we need. We'll do it with npm install, and we'll need Better Auth and MongoDB. So the libraries are installed, so let's go ahead and create code. In the auth.cs file, we're going to be configuring Cognito provider. So we're going to import Better Auth from Auth, Mongo client from MongoDB, and MongoDB adapter. So we're going to create Mongo client, and we'll call the DB method on the client to get the database. And then we'll create a Better Auth configuration. So in this configuration, we'll configure database with a MongoDB adapter. Then we're going to have a user property, but let's come to this a little bit later. So we'll just jump straight to the social providers section. And in this social providers section, you can configure different social providers. In our case, we want to configure Cognito. So we're going to define client ID, and we're going to put the environment variable, Cognito client ID, and client secret, domain, region, user pool, and the scope. So we will create this Cognito environment variables a little bit later. And speaking of the scope, so we need to specify email, OpenID, profile, and aws.cognito.signin.user.admin scope. That's kind of longer scope, but this scope will be needed in order to update user information. And one thing to note, these scopes need to match exactly the scopes that we're going to be defining in Cognito. Next, we're going to have get user info function. So after this authentication goes through, right, the exchange happens with Cognito, and Cognito gives the token. So what we're going to do is basically Better Auth going to give us the token, and we can request from the Cognito additional information, and we'll do it through Auth to user info endpoint. This is a standard endpoint for providers that support OpenID Connect or OIDC standard. This will be a GET request, and we'll put headers authorization, where we're going to be sending the access token to authenticate with that endpoint and get additional information about the user from Cognito. If we don't get a good response, we'll throw an error. However, if we get a response, we will grab the user information from the Cognito. And then we're going to return the user object and the data object. And this user object should have particular structure. It should have ID. Then it should also have name, email, and email verified. And it also optionally can have image. But besides those fields that are standard for Better Auth, we are also going to tack on the sub and username. So you can see that we are returning ID as user info sub as well. However, MongoDB has specific IDs, right? They're objects. So Better Auth will actually override this ID and it will not let us save or use Cognito ID of the user, which is the sub. But we will need to return ID anyways. So we'll just assign user info.sub to ID, but Better Auth will just override it to the regular MongoDB ID. Then sub will be the actual user ID in the Cognito, and we will need this to reference obviously Cognito user. And then we will also grab the username. So this username will be needed later on for us to be able to update users' information in Cognito. However, we cannot just tack on sub and username properties and Better Auth will record them. We actually need to tell Better Auth that we have these additional fields, and the way we do it, we'll have this user object and we will specify additional fields, and we'll say sub. This will be a type of string and it will be required, and then we'll have a username also will be type of string and required true. We are all set configuring Cognito provider. Let's set up Mongo database. The easiest way to set up MongoDB for development is to use Docker, so please be sure you have a Docker desktop installed on your local machine. In the root of our project, we're going to be creating a new file, and it's going to be called dockercompose.yaml. And in this file, we're going to put the following code. This is a very simple Docker Compose code. So we're going to have one service, which will be a MongoDB. We'll be using image Mongo 7.0. Container name will be Next.js Better Auth Cognito. We will be using the standard MongoDB port 27017, which we will map to the internal port in the container 27017. The environment variables will be username admin, password will be password, and the database name will be task manager. Then we will define the volumes and the networks. So let's go ahead and spin up the Mongo database with the command docker compose op-d. And if you don't have a container, Mongo 7.0, it will take some time to pull it. In my case, I already have the container pulled, so I have MongoDB spun up fairly fast. Finally, let's go ahead and define environment variables. We're going to create .env file in the root of our project. And here we're going to put the following variables. So we're going to use node environment as development. Next public app URL will be our local host. The better auth secret, we'll just put a random kind of secret right here. And let me actually show you how you can generate it real quick. If we go back to Better Auth documentation here under Get Started, right? We can click on the installation, and right here it says Set Environment Variables, right? We have the secret key, and we can click on the button right here, Generate Secret Key. It will generate the key for us. We can just copy this, and then we can go back to the Visual Studio Code, and right here we can just paste a new Better Auth secret. Our Better Auth URL will be also HTTP localhost 3000, and then we're going to define a MongoDB URI. We'll use a MongoDB protocol. Username will be admin, password will be password, and we will be connecting on localhost and port 27017, and the database name will be task manager. We're all set here. Now we can go into AWS console to configure user pool so we can fill out this Cognito environment variables. I am in AWS console in Amazon Cognito section right here, and we'll need to create a new user pool. We'll just simply click on a button, Create User Pool. Back in the days, creating and configuring Cognito user pool was a bit involved process, but nowadays they streamlined it, so we'll be configuring it real fast. So first we have define your application section, and in this section you basically choose what kind of application type you can do. We will just do traditional web application. However, you have an option for single page application, mobile app, and machine-to-machine application. So then we need to name our application. We will call it Next.js Better Auth Cognito App Client. Next, we have configure options section, and these configuration options are necessary for the user pool, and those options cannot be changed, right? If you want to change these settings, you will have to create a new user pool. So you got to kind of think what you really need here. So we have options for sign-in identities. In our case, we're just going to be using email. However, you can use phone number, username, or all of them actually. So the next is self-registration. We will keep the self-registration enabled, so we will let users register, and then we're going to have required attributes for sign up. And in our case, we're going to select name. So we'll require a user to enter name when they sign up, and obviously email, because they will be signing up with an email. And again, we have this warning that options for sign-in identities and required attributes can be changed after the app has been created. So you got to kind of think through first what you need for those options. Finally, down here we have a return URL, and this return URL is also known as a callback URL. This URL will be used by the Cognito to return the code to our application, and this code will be exchanged for the tokens. And Better Auth will do it automatically for us. We just have to specify this return URL. In order to find this return URL, we're going to go to Better Auth documentation. We're going to go to concepts, and here on Auth, right, we have this section where it says redirect URI. So we'll click on the redirect URI, and it says custom redirect URI for the provider, and by default is /API auth callback, and then the provider name in our case will be Cognito. So let's go ahead and copy this, and then we're going to go back to the Cognito user pool settings right here. In our case, we're going to have HTTP, not HTTPS, because we're developing locally, and then we're going to have local host 3000, and then we're just going to paste that's what we copied, API auth callback, and instead of provider name here, we will just type in Cognito. And later on, when you deploy this application in production, you can add another return URL. You can have multiple return URLs, so it will contain your production callback URL or return URL where you'll be using HTTPS instead of HTTP. So finally, all we have to do is to click Create User Directory. Next, we redirect it to the page that kind of gives us some code examples here, but we're going to scroll all the way down and just click on Go to Overview. And this is overview of the Cognito user pool and other Cognito settings. I'm not going to go through all of these settings. I actually have a specific video for that. So if you want to dive deeper into Cognito user pool and its settings, please check out my video, Amazon Cognito user pools made easy, setup and settings you must know. In the overview section right here, we can actually rename our user pool. Let's go ahead and do just that. We will call it Next.js Better Auth Cognito Pool. Next, we can copy this user pool ID, and this is one of our environment variables. So let's switch back to Visual Studio Code, and here in the Cognito user pool ID, we're going to just paste that ID that we copied. So next, we're going to visit right here on the left-hand side. There's different sections, and we're going to visit the app clients and the application. So this is our app client that we created. So we can click into this. Here, let's copy client ID and client secret. So let's put it in our environment variables. So we'll put Cognito client ID right here, and then let's go and copy Cognito client secret. And needless to say, this client secret should be kept, well, secret. You shouldn't show it to anybody. In my case, I'm going to delete this user pool after I'm done with this video. Besides the client ID and client secret, this app client information have settings about the tokens. So if you click on edit right here, you can choose here your authentication flows. We just keep authentication flows as is, and most importantly, you can actually choose different session duration, refresh token expiration, access token expiration, and ID token expiration. But in our case, we will keep it the same as is. So next, we have a section that gives us a quick setup guide. Those are attributes permissions, right? Those are attributes that this app client has access to. But most importantly, we actually need to click on the login pages right here. When using Cognito authentication, we will be using Cognito's managed login page. So we will be redirected to this login page, and then we're going to use it to log in or create a user. And here in the login pages section, right, we can click edit. And that's where we can have the allowed callback URLs. Like I said, you can add multiple callback URLs. You can see you can configure identity provider right here, and then Auth 2.0 grant type. We just keep it the same. However, we will need to adjust our OpenID connect scopes. As you may have remembered, in auth.ts file, we put the following scopes right here. We configured email, OpenID, profile, and AWS.Cognito.signin.user.admin. So these scopes need to match the scopes in Cognito. Let's go ahead and make sure they do match. So back in Cognito, we have email OpenID. We do not need the phone. However, we will need the profile and AWS.Cognito.signin.user.admin. So let's select those scopes, and then we can click on the Save Changes. Great. Next up, we have a user management section. We have users right here, which is essentially your user directory, right? We'll visit this section a little bit later. Under authentication, right, we have authentication methods. Let's click on that. So in this authentication methods section, you have an email card right here, which you can click edit. And currently for development, we're using send emails with Cognito. However, when you go to production, you will need to configure email with Amazon SES, which stands for Simple Email Service. We're not going to make any changes in this section. Another interesting section here is password policy, right? If you click edit here, you can use either Cognito default password, and these are password requirements, which we will keep as is. However, you can also have your custom password requirements. You just need to switch to custom and define them right here. So, but like I said, we'll just keep Cognito defaults. Next up, we have a sign-in section. Let's click on that. In the sign-in section, we can actually enable multi-factor authentication, right? So here, currently there is no MFA. You can have optional MFA, or you can require MFA. So let's go ahead and require MFA right here for our application, and we're going to be using the MFA method. We'll just choose Authenticator apps, but you can also choose SMS or email message. Let's go ahead and click Save, and just like that, we enabled multi-factor authentication for our application. Nice and easy. So next, we also have this section, device tracking, and this section will allow us to remember the device, meaning, when we have a multi-factor authentication enabled, right, we can remember the device for a certain amount of time, so user doesn't have to do multi-factor authentication every time. So let's go ahead and actually do that. Always remember, and we'll just choose allow users to bypass MFA for trusted devices, which is going to select yes. So next, let's go ahead and click Save Changes. The next section is a sign up section in authentication. Here we're going to be using actually custom attributes, but we will visit this section a little bit later. We also have social and external providers right here, and you can add an identity provider. You can add identity provider or social login to your Better Auth, right? But here we actually going to be adding our social provider like Google in Cognito direct. We're gonna go through Cognito using Google or Facebook, or you can do sign in with Apple, and it also supports SAML and just generic OpenID Connect protocol. But we're gonna be configuring this a little bit later. So let's go back to our social and external providers section right here, and then in the authentication section, the final one is extensions. Here you can add Lambda triggers. We will also actually use this section. We will have a Lambda trigger to add a custom scopes to our access token, and then we'll use these scopes for access control levels, right? So certain users will have certain permissions. We're gonna skip the security section, but actually a good thing about the security you can check out is AWS WAF, which is AWS Firewall, where you can set rate limiting and other security stuff for your user pool. We'll just go to actually branding and the domain. And right here, we actually have this Cognito domain. So we can copy this because, again, it is one of our environment variables. So we're gonna go back to our application, and here in the environment variables we will put Cognito domain, and here it copied out with HTTPS, but we have to be careful because we're using HTTPS right over here when we're calling get user info function. So let's go ahead, and in the .env file we're going to delete HTTPS and just use US West, right, the Cognito domain. And finally, Cognito region, as you already guessed, will be US West 2 as well. And let's go ahead and switch back to the browser to finish this branding section. So in this Cognito domain, right, you can create actually your, you can choose managed login or hosted UI. Hosted UI was an old one. Nowadays it's managed login. So you want to keep it as managed login. And then you can also have your custom domain, right? This section kind of explains how you use your custom domain, obviously to be in your own domain, and how you can add the certificate. Finally, branding section contains the managed login section, where you can actually create styles for your managed login. And if you click in here, it's going to show you kind of the default style for it. You have this kind of sign-in page, so you can just add a different background, kind of have a different styling for the text. However, text itself, I don't think it's possible, at least at the time of recording, to change it. But still, you can have some options to configure this page and kind of make it look like your application. Finally, in the branding section, you have message templates. Here you basically can update or change the messages that Cognito sends, when you have a verification email or invitation email or MFA message. All right, we are all actually set with configuring Cognito and setting up our environment variables. Now let's go ahead and use Better Auth and Cognito to create authentication for our application. Let's go back to Better Auth documentation, and here in the installation section, we can actually go ahead and skip to the step 7, right? We already did all the other steps. Step 7 is to mount Better Auth route handler, and for the most part, this route handler will be used to communicate with the Cognito using Auth 2.0 protocol. In Next.js application, we need to create app API auth all route.ts file. Let's go ahead and do that. Back in Visual Studio Code, in the app folder, we're gonna be creating API folder. In this API folder, we'll create auth folder. In the auth folder, we create the folder for all the routes, which is square bracket, 3 dots, all, and close square brackets. And then finally, we're going to create a route.ts file. And we can simply just go back to documentation, copy the code it provides, and put it in the route.cs file that we just created. The next step will be to create a client instance. So basically, we're going to pretty much use the same code. Let's go ahead and create a client instance. In the Visual Studio Code, in the lib folder, let's create a file called auth-client.ts. And we're going to put the following code in there. So we're basically going to import create auth client from better auth React, right? Because we're using React. And then we're going to configure auth client with a base URL, which will be the next public app URL. And then for convenience, we'll also export like sign in and sign out. That's basically the code for the auth client. Now let's go ahead and update our code to use route handlers and the auth client. But before we do that, if you're enjoying the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. The first thing that we're going to do is update our landing page. So let's go ahead and paste a different code right here. The code pretty much going to be actually the same. All we're going to be using instead of the link, we're going to be using the login button right here. And now we're going to create a components folder to actually have the code for this login button. In the SRC folder, let's create a components folder. So in the components folder, let's go ahead and create the new file called loginbutton.tsx. Now we're going to put the following code in there. So this code contains the logic for this login button, right? On a click, we're going to have a handle login, and this handle login function will actually use the sign in function that we exported, right, from the auth client to assign us into the Cognito, right? It will basically redirect us to the Cognito's managed UI. We also provided the callback URL here, and in this case, the callback URL is basically where we want to redirect user after the user is logged in. The next thing that we're going to do, we're going to update the navigation component right here. So the main thing in this navigation component that we are going to do, we're basically going to use the session data, and we're going to be calling use session on the auth client right here. And in this session data is basically we're after the user, right? So we can display the username using this session data in our navigation bar. And then also we will add a logout button right here. We're going to have a handle logout, and this handle logout handler will basically be calling the sign out. So it's going to be signing out the user using better auth. And after user is signed out, it will be redirected on the landing page. So the sign in and sign out functionality is done. Creating user functionality will be handled by Cognito. So all we have to do is actually protect our routes, right? The dashboard route and the tasks route, so they can be only accessed by authenticated users. We can do this by using Next.js middleware, and actually Next.js middleware was renamed to proxy. So in the SRC file, let's create a file called proxy.cs. In this file, we're going to just put standard kind of middleware code here. Let's take a look at how it works. Basically, we get next request and next response. The function will be called proxy instead of the middleware. We'll specify the protected routes here. Then we're going to check if the route is protected. So if this route is protected, we're going to get the cookie that is called better auth session token. You can also rename cookie if you would like a different name for this cookie. So if you go to better auth documentation, in the cookie section, it's going to show you how to rename that. Then we're going to check if there is session, or better, if there is no session, right? Then we're going to redirect user to the landing page. However, if the user is logged in, right, there is a session, we will just return next response next, so the user can go through. And then finally, we'll create another if statement, right? If the user is logging and they're visiting the landing page, there is no need for them to be on the landing page, right? We can check, the session, and if the session is there, we'll just redirect user to the dashboard. Finally, we're going to export config constant that will have a matcher to match the routes right here, which is basically our landing page, dashboard routes, and tasks routes if we have more routes. And you can also use a regex for that as well. So you can just take a look at the Next.js documentation. And we're all set. So let's go ahead and test our application. We'll spin up the dev server with npm run dev. In the browser, we're going to visit localhost 3000, and our application is up and running. Let's click Get Started button. And this button redirected us to Cognito Managed Login, so prompting us to sign in. However, we do not have an account, so we can click on Create Account. In order to sign up, we need an email address. So let's go and use the temp mail. So let's copy the address here and paste it into the email address field. In the name, we're going to just simply put Alex. And then we're going to just put the password and we're going to confirm the password. All right, and now we can click sign up. We're prompted to confirm our account, so let's go back to temp mail. We received a verification code that Cognito sent us, so let's go ahead and copy it. And we're going to go and paste it into the confirmation. And let's go ahead and click confirm account. And now we prompted with a multi-factor authentication. Let me go ahead and set it up real fast. And the code is 259178. Let's do that and click sign in. So we're in the dashboard page, right? We can go ahead and visit the tasks, right? If we're going to try to go back to the landing page, right? Click, we get redirected back to the dashboard because we're signed in. And finally, in order to log out, right, we can click on the user icon and click log out. And also, as you can see, we're displaying the name of the user that we got from the session. So let's go ahead and log out. And now we are logged out and obviously cannot visit dashboard page or our tasks page. So our authentication is working. Now, if we visit Cognito, for example, go to our user pool, which we need to click on user management right here. And then we can see that we have our user that was created in Cognito with an email and username, and it's also have a status of confirmed. And also, if we go and switch to the database, and I'm using a table plus here to inspect the database, we can see all these models or documents are in the database: account, session, user, and verification. And if we click, for example, on the account, so we have some information here, and in the user, if we click on the user, we can see the information about the user. We have the name, we have the email verified, and most importantly, we have our custom field, which is sub right here, and the username. In our case, they're the same, but sometimes they can be different, so it's nice to record both of them. Our authentication is working. Now let's see how we can implement access level controls or simply permissions. In order to implement permissions, we need to apply them to actions. We have MongoDB set up locally. Let's go ahead and create CRUD, or create, read, update, and delete functionality for the tasks in our application. To make things a little bit easier from the database communication perspective, we're going to be using Mongoose. Mongoose is object document mapper. It will basically map the models from the database to our application. And if you worked with relational database, the counterpart of Mongoose will be object relational mapper, such as SQLize or Prisma. Let's install Mongoose with the command npm install Mongoose. In the lib folder, let's create a new file called mongodb.ts. In this file, we're going to put the following code to configure connection to Mongo database using Mongoose. The code looks a little bit complex, but this is because we are accounting for caching to avoid multiple connections when TurboPack reloads. So we will import Mongoose from Mongoose, and then we'll create MongoDB URI. We'll use environment variable MongoDB URI. So next, we're going to create an interface that's called cached connection. Then we're going to declare global Mongoose cache. Next, we're going to have the cached connection and assign global Mongoose cache to it. And if there is nothing cached, right, we're going to assign connection null and promise null to global Mongoose cache. Next, we will be exporting the function connect to database, and this function will be actually using cache to account for multiple connections. So if there is cached connection, we're going to return that connection. If there is no cached connection, we're going to be basically creating a connection, and then we will be caching it. And then we're going to return that cached connection. Finally, we will do default export of connect to database. Next, we need to create a task model for Mongoose to use. So in src folder, let's create another folder called models. And in this folder, we're going to create a file called task.ts, and this will be a task model, so the name of the file is capitalized. And in this file, we're going to put the following code. So we basically are defining the task model. We're going to import Mongoose, document and schema types from Mongoose. We'll create an interface, iTask interface for this model, and then we're going to declare the task schema. We'll instantiate the new task schema, which will be basically implementing the interface iTask. The schema will have the following properties: name, will be type of string. It will be required. We're going to trim it, and max length we'll just put at 100 characters. Description will have the string type. Again, we're going to trim description, and max length will be 500 characters. We're going to have a due date. We're going to have a field created by. This is basically going to be referencing the user ID. So we're going to put schema types object ID for the type, and this field created by will be required. And finally, we're going to have a completed field, right? And it will be Boolean. We're going to just set default to false. And also, optionally, but I usually do that, I set the timestamps as well. Finally, we are going to assign this model, right, to the task. And the way we're going to do it, we're going to call the method model on Mongoose. We'll pass the name of the name how we're going to call this model, and then we'll assign it this task schema that we created. But also we are accounting for Next.js, and we're going to first check if model already exists to avoid override model error in the development. And at the end, we're going to export task as default. Next, let's go ahead and create task actions in lib folder. Let's create a new file called task actions. And in this file, we're going to be putting the code for creating, reading, updating, and deleting the tasks, or basically the CRUD. This will be a server action. We're also going to be importing connect to database from MongoDB file task and the task interface from the task model. So first we are going to create a function to get tasks, right? And it's going to be get tasks action, and we're going to pass the user ID because we need to get only tasks related to the user. We'll create a connection. We'll check actually if the user ID really exists, right? We will use the task model to get the tasks that are created by that user, and we'll sort them created at -1, it meaning sort by descending order. We will return the tasks as a JSON plain object, so we'll achieve it to just basically doing this trick. We're going to be stringifying the tasks, converting into JSON, and then parsing it back from the JSON. And if we get any errors, we're going to log the error and then throw an error as well. Next, we're going to have create task action, where we're going to pass the task data and user ID. Next, we're going to distract name, description, and due date from the task data. We're going to check if name is actually not empty, although the model have that constraint. We're also going to check it in the code and throw an error. If task name is empty, we'll tell it that it is required. Then we're going to create a new task. Then we'll save that task in the database. Again, return the task as a plain JavaScript object. Updating the task will look similar to creating task, but besides the user ID, we're also going to pass the task ID. So, and then, the fields to update. Again, we'll establish the connection. We'll check if the user ID exists, distract the properties. Next, we will verify the user actually owns the task. And if not, we're going to throw an error that the task is not found or user is not authorized. Then we're going to update the fields on the task model, and then we're going to save the task and then return it again as a plain JavaScript object. Delete task action is pretty simple. We'll pass the task ID and the user ID. We establish connection, check for the user ID, verify the task belongs to the user, and then we're just going to use delete one method on the task model to delete the task by ID. Finally, we have another action to toggle task completed action, so the user can check the task as completed or uncompleted. So this will be fairly simple function. We will really wrap around update task action, and we'll just pass the task ID and complete it, whichever not the current status of the task and the user ID. The backend is done, so let's create the front end. So we're gonna go to app, routes, tasks, right, and update the tasks route. Currently, it is kind of empty. It basically says there is no tasks right here, right? So let's go ahead and update the code, and we're going to put the following code in here. So what we are basically doing, and what is new to this code, is we are importing some redirect and headers and the navigation, and most importantly, the task component. And on this tasks page, we'll need to grab the tasks, and we're going to be using get tasks action, and we're going to call it server side. And in order to grab the tasks belonging to the user, we will actually need the user's ID. So we're going to get the headers. We're going to get the session. We're going to check, right, if there is session. If there is no session, we're going to redirect to the home page, meaning the user is not authenticated. And then we're going to grab the user from the session and get the user ID from from that user. As I said before, we're gonna grab the tasks using getTasks action and pass the user ID to it. And then towards the bottom, right, we're gonna have the tasks content component where we pass it the initial tasks that we got on the server side, and then also we'll pass it the user ID. In the components folder, let's go ahead and create tasks content.tsx file. This is going to be our tasks content component. So let's put the following code in here. And the job of this component is basically will be to display the task form. So users can enter the task form and also display the tasks list, right? So users can see their tasks. So we'll basically achieve that by creating this tasks form and tasks list, right? We're going to have the use state to set the tasks, right? If we create a new task and then open and close the form as well for creation of the tasks. Handle tasks created will basically set the tasks in the state, and then handle tasks updated will actually set the tasks and update those tasks. Finally, handle tasks deleted will remove the tasks from the list. So let's go ahead and create a couple more components, right? We'll need the task form component and the task list component. So in the components folder, let's create another file that will be called task form.tsx. Let's go ahead and paste the following code in here. This will be basically the code for creating the tasks, right? It will have different task input fields, as well as we're going to have some action here. The button, it's going to be basically cancel button and the create button. Since we're going to be creating the task, we're going to also import create task action from actions and interface from the task model. We'll also define the interface for the task form props. We'll be using the state for the form data. We'll also have the state for loading and state for the error. The handle change function will basically handle the change of the tasks fields. And finally, handle submit will basically creating the task, right? We just gonna do some housekeeping here of setting loading to true, setting error to null, and then we're gonna have create a new task action. We're gonna call it, and then if everything goes well, we'll just close the create task form. But if something goes wrong, we'll catch an error. And finally, whether everything is good or bad, we're just gonna set the loading to false, so the loader on the button doesn't show anymore. The next up is task list component. Let's create this file in the components. We'll call it task list.tsx. I'm gonna put the following code in there. The task list component will be a little bit of involved, right? We're gonna actually update the tasks in this component. We're going to be deleting the tasks, and we're going to be toggling the task as completed. So we're going to have the interface for task list props. We're also going to have an interface for edit form data. There's going to be a bunch of states right here that we're going to be using use state. Then we're going to have a handle edit start, right? So it's just basically we'll open the editing form. We're going to have handle edit cancel that will close the editing form. Obviously, we'll have also edit change where we're editing the task form data. And the edit submit will actually use the action of updating the task that will run on the server side that we created. If everything goes well, we'll call on task updated and pass it the updated task. And then if something goes wrong, obviously we'll throw an error. Then we're going to have handle toggle complete. So essentially have the same idea. It's going to use the toggle task complete action that behind the scenes actually going to call task update action. Finally, we're going to have the handle delete right here. The handle delete will also have a prompt. It's going to ask user, are you sure you want to delete this task? It's usually good practice to do that because this is a distractive action. If user agrees, so we're basically going to call delete task action. Finally, we're going to be doing the check if the task length equals to 0. So basically if there's any tasks, and if there are no tasks, we're going to be showing no tasks yet. Create your first task instead of this task list ultimately. The final thing that we need to do is actually to update the dashboard page. Currently, we have a fake data in here about completed tasks and total tasks. So let's go ahead and update the code to actually pull the number of tasks that are total and completed, since now we're going to have this data. As usual, we're going to grab the headers and then the session. And then obviously, if there is no session, we'll redirect to the home page, and we're going to get the user ID from that session. We're going to fetch the tasks using getTasks action, passing in the user ID. Then we're going to calculate the total tasks by looking at the task's length, and then completed task. We're just going to get the length of the tasks by filtering it where the task is completed. Just to mention, I'm using this code for simplicity, because if you have a lot of tasks in your database belonging to the user, if you load all your tasks in memory, you're basically going to overload the memory. So in the real world, you're actually, if you're using Mongoose, right, you're going to be using count document method on the model, right, to count actually the documents of the total tasks, and then you're going to also use the count document method to count the completed tasks. You just put completed true in there. This is going to be a better way than just, loading all the tasks in the memory and then filtering completed tasks. But here, like I said, I'm just doing it for simplicity so I can reuse my get tasks action. And then we're going to be using total tasks and completed tasks in the UI to display total and completed tasks to the user. We're all set. Let's go ahead and spin up the application with npm run dev and test our code. We're going to go to the browser, localhost port 3000. We see our application running. Let's click on get started. And we're logged into the application. And we can see that we have total tasks 0 and completed tasks 0. Let's click on the button view all tasks. So we have the tasks route right here. There are currently no tasks, so we are displaying that message. Let's add a task. So we're going to add the task, my first task. And description, this is my first task. And then we're going to click create task, and the task is created. Also create another task. Let's say put it second task. All right, now we have two tasks. So you can obviously update the task, right? If we can click on edit task, we're going to put the description, my second task. You can also complete your task. Let's complete the first task. And if we go to the dashboard, we can see now that we have two total tasks and completed one task. And if we go to view tasks, right, maybe we want to delete the task. We click on delete. We are prompted if we want to delete the task. Again, this is a fast way to do it. Obviously, to do it properly, you need to create a model. So, and then when user clicks OK, the task is deleted. And this is how you can create a CRUD for your application for entities such as task using MongoDB and Mongoose ODM. Now, since we have a task functionality, we can implement access level controls or permissions to basically constrain users what kind of actions they can perform on the tasks. The simplest way to do it is to actually have user roles, right, and allow or deny certain actions based on those roles. So in Cognito, we can actually add a custom property that is called role. So what we can do is to go to users, right? You can see our user, already authenticated user, or the only user in our app. We can click in here. We can have user attributes, right? So we only have email, name, and sub. So we want to add the role to the user attribute. So we can click edit right here. We have optional attributes right over here. However, we actually need another user attributes, and here there is an option to add additional attributes. So we can click on the add attributes. However, in the drop down, there is no role, right? So role attribute is not really like a default attribute in Cognito user pool. So what we need to do is to create a custom attribute, and the custom attribute you can create in a sign up experience. So let's go ahead and go to sign up experience. And here we have custom attributes. Let's add a custom attribute. The name of our custom attribute will be role. There's different types, right? You can select either string or number. In our case, it's a string, and you can put on minimum and maximum constraints. Those are optional, but we can just put like maybe 2, and then maximum we can do 255, for example. And we also have this checkbox to make it mutable or unmutable. We'll be changing the role, for example, from user to admin. So we want to have it mutable. So let's go ahead and click Save Changes. And now the attribute is created, and you have to note that the name of attribute is not really a role, it is custom : role. Now let's go ahead and use that attribute. So we'll go to user management, users, click on the user, and here we have user attributes. We click edit again, and now we can have an additional attribute. We'll add an attribute, and now we can select the custom attribute, which will be custom role right here, and the value right now, let's go ahead and put admin. Now we can go ahead and click Save Changes. Now our user has a custom role, and the value for the custom role is admin. Now all we need to do is to use role attribute in our code. So let's go to Visual Studio Code. Here in the lib folder, we have auth.ts file where we are configuring better auth. So we will need to add an additional field called role. to our user. Let's go ahead and do that. So this role will be a type of string. And then also we'll need to add this role to the output of the getUserInfo function. Let's add a property to the user object that is returned, and this property will be role. We'll grab UserInfo, and the role, the attribute's name is custom column role. So, and if there is no value there, we'll just assign a default user value to it. As you may have guessed, this role won't magically appear on the user in the database. So we need to go back to the browser. First, we need to go to the application, and we need to log out from the application. The next thing that we need to do is actually to clear our database, because BetterAuth does some caching. So let's go ahead and switch to the database, right? We have all these tables here, or rather documents. So let's go ahead and basically delete them. And finally, what we'll need to do is actually to get rid of BetterAuth cookie. So we're going to click on inspect. We're just going to go to application on the localhost 3000. We have BetterAuth state cookie. Let's go ahead and delete that too. So all our cache is basically cleared, and we can just do logging in from scratch, or rather without any caching. So let's go ahead and click get started again. And we are logged in. Now let's go ahead and check the database. And if we refresh the database right here, you can see that we got the new tables or documents. And then if we go to the user and we click on the user, we can see the new role is admin. This is great. Now we can use this role to allow or deny certain actions. So back in our code, let's say we want to allow only admins to create the tasks. I mean, this example is kind of contrived because tasks really belong to the user, but just for the sake of tutorial, let's do that. First, we need to implement this access level control in our task action, right? And namely create task action. So in the create task action, the first thing that we'll need to do, besides connecting to the database, obviously, if the user can actually perform create task action. And in this case, we cannot really trust, the user that it's passed from the front end to us, right? Because this create task action is running on the back end. This is a server action. So let's go ahead and remove actually the user ID from here. And we will grab the user now from the session. So first we're going to be doing is getting user from the verify session helper method. And then we're also going to be using another helper method that will check if user can actually create task. If user cannot, so we're going to throw an error, unauthorized. So let's go ahead and create verify session. In the lib folder, we're going to create another file. We'll call it actually a del.ts, and del stands for data access layer. So we're going to create the function in here, the verify session, right? And it's going to be, this data access layer kind of file. It will be only running on the server side because we will need to get headers, right? We'll actually import cache so we can cache the headers, so we don't have to pull those headers and call the database to find the session all the time. We'll grab auth from auth, and then we'll also have a next navigation to to redirect if there is no session. So here in the verify session, we're going to use the cache, and will be a async function. It will basically grab the header, then it's going to get the session from auth API, and the auth, instead of auth client, we're using auth API. This is how you can get session or get user on the server side using BetterAuth. And then we check if there is no session, we're going to redirect to homepage, and if there is session, we're going to just returning the user on that session. Next, we're going to create that utility function can that will help us to determine if user can do the action. And this can function should work on both client and server. So in the lib folder, we're going to create another file called utils.ts. Normally you'll put your utilities functions in that file. So, and we're going to have export function can, right? We're going to have pass it a user, and user will be a type of user that we're going to create in a minute. And then we're going to pass the function, and all that function will do is check if user can do a certain action. In our case, let's say if user can create a task, we're going to be returning user role. We're going to be checking if the user is an admin. And then the default return in our case will be true. Next, in the src folder, let's create the file called types.d.ts. That will be the file for our types. And we are going to put in here, we're going to have the user type, right? It's basically the same type that we're saving in the database. We'll have ID, created at, updated at, email verified, image if we have any, and I'm going to have the sub, and most importantly, the role right here. So our function can, for example, can basically check if that role has admin or just a regular user. So back in a task actions, all we have to do is import these functions. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to import verify session from DAL and can from utils. And finally, in task actions, the create task action, we'll need to do one more fix. Instead of user ID here, we're going to put user.id. The component that uses create task action is actually the task form, right? Let's go ahead and update it. So since we are not trusting our front end anymore, we'll just remove the user ID because create task action is not using user ID anymore. And then let's go ahead and find the code for the create task action, or rather where the create task action is used. And here we're gonna also remove the user ID. Now the task's content component is complaining because it is using the task form component. So let's go ahead and update that. And in this component, we're actually going to be checking if the user can create a task. So we're going to display that create task button, right? So we're going to import that can function from the lib utils. And then when we have a user ID right here, we don't have user ID anymore. Now it's a user and it's a type of user. Now in the task content props here, we can also update this to the user. And now where we are passing the user ID to the task list, right, we can just put user.id. And finally, we need to update the code. Now it's going to become conditional, right, where the user can add the task only if they're admin or they actually can do it. So let's go ahead and do just that. We'll just check if the user can create that task. Then we're obviously going to show the add new task button. If not, then they obviously won't be able to do that. And actually the task form is still complaining, so we basically don't need the user ID property anymore there because we just removed it. So let's go ahead and save the changes now. I think we should be okay. And where we needed the user ID is actually on the task list. So let's put user.id in here. Now the tasks page is complaining because it uses the task content. So, and obviously now we're using the user rather than user ID. So let's go ahead and delete this and put user as user right here. And we should be all set. Now let's check if everything is still working. Let's go to the browser. We have our application running. The user is logged in. So let's go to view tasks. There's obviously no view tasks. We have an add new task button right here. So let's go ahead and add a new task, and our user, as we remember, is admin, so we can actually add a new task. So this we'll put a new task as a task name, and we'll click create task. So everything is still working. So now let's go ahead and update the user role in the Cognito user pool to the regular user and see if now we can create a task. So here we have a custom role admin. Let's click in the user pool and update it to just user. And now we can click save changes. And here we go. Now our user is a regular user. However, our application still cannot let user to add new task because in order to pick up the new role, we need to log out the user and then log in again. Let's go ahead and switch to the database. And here, let's go ahead again and remove all the tables or all the documents to be on the safe side and clear it out. And in the browser, we're going to go ahead and also clear the better auth cookie, state cookie, right? So let's go ahead and delete that. And now, let's go ahead and log in. And now let's go ahead and switch to the database. And yeah, if we refresh, you can see that role is the user now. So what you got to keep in mind when developing using better auth, it does a little bit of caching. So you basically need to remove all this data and then remove the better auth state, right? And then, you can get a new state or the new update when you are in development. So let's go back to the browser and our user is logged in. Now we can go ahead and click on view tasks. And now we do not see the button to add a new task because our user has a role of user and we're only allowing the admins to create the tasks. And this is how you can implement a simple access control level or permissions using just role property stored in your Cognito. However, Auth 2.0 authentication and OpenID Connect actually provides us with an access token that one of those claims is scopes, and those scopes can be actually used to have a more granular permissions for the user. And let's go ahead and take a look at how to do it. If we go to auth.cs file, we can see that we specify the scopes right here. However, we can add more scopes. We can add scopes specify if the user can read tasks, update tasks, delete tasks, or view tasks. However, specifying the scopes right here won't work because, well, we need to actually know who the user is, right? What their role before we can assign those scopes. And we can actually do it in Cognito using extensions, and specifically Lambda triggers. Now let's go ahead and add a Lambda trigger. Here, let's select Authentication Lambda trigger, and what we need to do is to actually specify that we need to do a pre-token generation trigger. And in this pre-token generation trigger, we have a few options, right? Now we need just a middle option, basic feature, access token customization for user identity. So we'll need to customize access token. So we'll choose the second one. And here we'll need to select Lambda. From this dropdown, I actually have a couple of those Lambdas, but I'm going to create a new Lambda function. So you can click on the create Lambda function. So here in the Lambda functions, let's click on create Lambda function. We're going to be authoring Lambda from scratch. Let's name it Next.js Cognito Better Auth Token Lambda. We'll just keep runtime as Node.js 24x. That's the current long-term support, or LTS. And we're actually going to just click create function. Here we have the index.mjs file. So let's go ahead and update it. So we're going to be exporting the handler. And in this handler, right, we're going to have access to user attribute from the event that Cognito will pass into this Lambda when it triggers this Lambda after user logs in, but before generating the tokens. We will define our base scopes, which will be read tasks and update tasks. And then we're going to check if the user's role is admin, right? We will add additional scopes, create tasks and delete tasks. So essentially our admin user will be able to create tasks and delete tasks, and regular users will only be able to view tasks and update tasks. We're keying off of the role here. However, in the user attributes, you also can have user ID or other properties, which means you can look actually in your database, right? If you have the permission structure set up in your database, you can look up a user ID, right? And see what kind of permissions or scopes that user is assigned, or maybe roles. And based on that, you can push the correct scopes or assign the correct scopes to the scope claim. So here you can be basically as flexible as you want. Finally, we are updating the response on the event, right? And it has to be in a specific form, right? We're going to have the claim, so scope override details, right? ID token generation will leave as is, but access token generation, right? We're going to add scopes, the scopes that we defined, and then we will return the event. And if you would like to learn more about, how to structure this response and different types of versions, you can go to AWS documentation and you can basically Google pre-token generation Lambda trigger, and here it will explain all other things, how you can customize your access token or ID token and how to return the responses, and it will give you some examples as well. In our case, we're all set. Let's click on the deploy. So the changes are saved. Now let's go back to our Lambda triggers. We're gonna refresh this, and in the dropdown, we should see our Next.js Cognito Better Auth Token Lambda. So let's go ahead, select it, and add this Lambda trigger. All right, Lambda trigger is added. Now we need to make some changes in our code. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. So now we need to extract these scopes from the token and actually record them, so later on we can use them, right? And the way we can do it is with a library JSON Web Token. So let's go ahead and do npm install JSON Web Token. And we also need to install types for JSON Web Token as a dev dependencies. So let's do it with npm install add types JSON Web Token and with a flag D. We're all set. Let's go ahead and update the code in auth.cs file. First, we're going to import JWT from JSON Web Token. Next, we're going to add new attribute to our user additional field. It will be called permissions, right? And it's going to be a type of string. So we're going to be recording the scopes or permissions as a string, comma, separated. And that's how they're recorded on the access token claim. They're basically a string, comma, separated. Next, in the user info function, right here, when we get the user info response, we can use the jwt.decode method to decode the access token. And we get the decoded variable right here. So this will be the decoded token. And finally, we will add permissions to our user by accessing the scope property on the decoded token. Let's go ahead and test our code. We'll run npm run dev. Let's go to the browser. Our application is running. Looks like we're logged in. So let's go ahead and log out. And then we're going to go into the database. And we would want to, again, do the clean start. So let's go ahead and delete everything here. Let's delete all the sessions. We can delete it, including the tasks as well. And then we can go back to the browser and let's go ahead and delete that better auth state cookie. We're all set. Let's go ahead and try signing in. We got redirected to Cognito managed UI. Let's go ahead and put the email address. Click next, and then we can paste the password. We click continue. We are prompted for the multi-factor authentication. Let's put the code in there and click sign in. Now let's go to the database. We can refresh, right? And now we can see that our user actually has the permissions attribute, right? And besides the default scopes, we also have read tasks and update tasks scopes, since the user's role is user. Now all we have to do is to use these scopes in the code to protect access to our application. First of all, let's go ahead and update user type in types.d.ts. Right, let's go add permissions. It will be a type of string. Next, we can update the can function, right? In our utils.ts file, we have this can function, what user can and cannot do. So let's update this if statement. In the if statement, we're going to check if user does not have a permission to do certain action, for example, create task, right? If they do not, right, we'll return false. Otherwise, we're assuming they're going to have that permission and we will return true. Next, we're going to update the tasks actions.ts file. So here we will basically get the user in each action function, right? Get tasks action, for example. Again, we're going to get the user from a session because we cannot trust the front end, right? And we're going to check if the user can, in our case, get task action requires read tasks scope. So we're going to check if the user can do it, right? We're going to allow user to read tasks or to get tasks. However, if the user cannot do that, we will throw an error. And here also I'm still passing the user ID right here, but you can actually delete this and update your code correspondingly, because you can also get the user ID on this user object. So the next thing is going to be create a new task. Again, same idea. We'll get user from the session, right? Check if this user can create tasks. If not, throw an error, and then allow user to create task if the user has the scope. Update task have the same scope, as well as delete task. And as I mentioned before, you don't need user ID here anymore, because you can get the ID of the user from the user object, and you just can update these functions or task actions, and also the code, the components that call them as well. Next, let's go ahead and update the task list component, right? So now we can use the can function to check if the user can perform certain actions. So we will also update the interface task list props, because now we need to pass the user rather than the user ID. So we're going to pass the user in the tasks list. And now in all these functions that we have, right, we can update wherever we have user ID, we put user.id, for example, update task action, toggle complete task action, and then also delete task action. We can also pass the user ID. But most importantly, we can use the UI to actually check if the user can update the tasks, for example, right? Or the user can delete the tasks. So if so, we can show that button on the UI so the user can click to update the task or delete the task. As you know, we also put the protection on the backend, right, in the form of the actions. So we're also checking if the user can do those actions. Finally, let's go ahead and update the code in the task content, right? So now instead of user ID, we'll just need to pass the user, and we should be all set. Now let's go ahead and switch into the browser to see if our code is working. We're going to click on the button View All Tasks, and as you can see, we do not have a button to be able to create the task, or if we were to have tasks, we won't be able to delete those tasks or see the button to delete those tasks because we do not have these permissions, because our user type or user role is just a user. Let's go ahead and update the user again to the admin. So let's go to Cognito user pool, click on the user, and then edit user attributes, and let's go ahead and put the custom role as admin. Let's click save changes. Now the user is admin. All we have to do is to log out now. Let's go ahead and log in again. Now we should get the enough permissions, right? Because the user is admin. So when we click on view all tasks, we have the button to add a new task. Let's check if it's working. So we're gonna put the task name my first task and check if we can create actually the task, which we can do because now our user is admin and allowed to create tasks. And this is how you can use access token scopes to set permissions for the user as granular as you want. Now let's switch gears and add a social login to our application. Better Auth allows us to connect different social providers, and we have under authentication a lot of them, but we're gonna go a different route. We'll actually connect our social login, Google, through Cognito. In order to add social login such as Google to our application using Cognito, we can go to Cognito user pool that we just created. On the left-hand side, under authentication, we have social and external providers. Let's click on that, and we can click on add identity provider. And here you have several options. You can do Facebook, Amazon, Apple, SAML, OpenID Connect. It's just the kind of general stuff. Or you can use Google, right? Let's go ahead and use Google here. We select Google. What we need to do here is we need to add client ID, client secret, and authorized scopes. And then we also need to map the attributes. Since we have one attribute name, right, we will need to map the attributes from Google. So how do we do that? You can click on the registration instructions right here, and it basically gives you the steps that you need to do in order to get the client ID and client secret from Google. So it tells us to go to developer account, create a project, and add the domain, and then create Auth 2.0 credentials, and also add Auth domain ID response URL. And then we can add Auth client ID and client secret of Google to this identity provider configuration. So let's go ahead and do just that. Here I am in Google Developer Console. Let's go ahead and create a new project. We can call our project React Router App Cognito Auth. And we just leave as is, no organization. I don't think I have any, right? So, and we can click create. Right after we created this new project, but this looks like it still gives us the overview of the old project that I created. So we need to switch to the React Router App Cognito project, right? So I'm just going to make sure we are here. So it says Google Auth platform is not configured yet. We can just get started, right? So app information, we can use the same name for the app, React Router App Cognito Auth. Then supported email, right? You can select your email right here. So select your Google email, obviously, right? You can click next. Audience. Audience will be external audience. Then you can click next. On the contact information, you can put email, again, email address, whatever you want to be contacted. It doesn't have to be the same as your Google email address. Then you click next. You agree to Google API services and user data policy. And let's click continue and let's click create. Next, what we're going to do is to create Auth client. So let's click on that. In the application type, let's select web application. The client name, we can name it Cognito client. And now we need to add authorized JavaScript origins. That's what Cognito information was talking about, right? So we need to add a URI. So if we go back, right, it's going to tell us add your user pool domain. And we already know that we can go on the left-hand side right here. If we need to look up the domain right here on the domains, right? You can get your domain here. So, but I already have it copied. So let me just put it in. All right. And the next thing that we need to do is authorize redirect URI. So right here in Cognito in step 5, the authorized redirect URI is basically your user pool domain / auth2 ID response. Let's go ahead and add that to Google. I copied it already as well, and I'm going to just paste it, right? And now we click create button. All right, and that's what we have here. We have a client ID. So let's go ahead and copy this client ID. We can put it in our client ID in Cognito. Okay, let's click OK. And we got this Cognito client, right? And we also have a client secret right here. So you're going to copy this client secret and you can put it into your client secret right here in the Cognito as well. Next, we need to put the authorized scopes, right? And in our case, we're going to put the same scopes as we had before, right? We put the scopes OpenID, email, and profile. Let's go ahead and do just that. And you can make sure you separate your scopes with spaces. And finally, let's go ahead and map the name attribute to the Google attribute. So the one that we can use is the name attribute in Google attributes. So it's going to get mapped in our Cognito token, basically, right? So let's go ahead and do that. And I guess we're all set. So we can click Add Identity Provider. The next thing that we need to do is to add Google Identity Provider that we created to the login screen, right? So we can do that by going to App Clients in Cognito. We can create React Router Cognito Auth client. And here we have login pages. So let's select that. We can click Edit. So now if we look at the Identity Provider section of the login configuration, if we click on the dropdown, we can also see the Google. So now we can use both Cognito User Pool as Identity Provider and Google as well. Let's select that. And all we have to do is to save changes. Back in Visual Studio Code, let's spin up our application with npm run dev. We can switch to the browser where our application is running on localhost port 3000. Let's click Get Started. And we got redirected to Amazon Managed Login. And as you can see, we have Sign In with Google button right here. So we have an integration with Google through the AWS Cognito. So let's go ahead and click on Sign In with Cognito, or rather Sign In with Google. And I'm already signed in with Google, so the app simply redirects me to the dashboard, right? And I'm here as a new user. Obviously, there's no tasks, and I have a different name right over here. But since we did not set up the role for this user, it defaults to basically a user, and this user cannot really create tasks or delete tasks, which is consistent with our access level controls. Now that we have a solid authentication for our application, the final part that we want to address is the ability of the user to change their profile information. For example, if they want to change their name or email or even password. So let's go ahead and take a look how to do that. If we go to Better Auth documentation, here under concepts, we actually have the section users and accounts. And in this section, you can read basically how to update the user and change their email, and I think even change their password if you're using username and email sign up through Better Auth. However, we are using Cognito. So in our case, not only we need to update the user information with a Better Auth, or namely in our database, in our session, right? But also we will need to update this information in Cognito as well. To update user information in Cognito, we can use AWS SDK for JavaScript. So you can go to docs.aws.amazon.com. And then here, when you scroll down all products, you can search for JavaScript. And you can see that you have AWS SDK for JavaScript. You click on that. The current version of SDK is version 3 that we are going to use. And here you have developer guide. So you can click on that. And it's going to give you some information about what is AWS SDK, how to get started, how to configure SDK for JavaScript, and much more. However, we'll just jump into the API reference. That's kind of the most important part. And here on the left-hand side, you need to find Cognito Identity Provider, right? There's different services right here in alphabetical order, right? And you can find Cognito Identity Provider. I start this library already or service already, so it shows up on top for me, and I'm going to click right here. On this page, you can find how to install client Cognito Identity Provider, and there's different operations here that you can search. For example, we'll need update user attributes, so let's type update user attributes, and we have here admin update user attributes command. You can click on this command, and then it's going to basically show you an example of the syntax, how you going to use it. So basically you create Cognito Identity Provider client, right? You put the configuration right here, and basically then you're going to create the command with your configuration input, and then you're going to send the command. And all the other commands, you follow the same pattern. Down below, it will give you the update user attributes command input, and you're also gonna get the command output. That's what you get back. And besides that, you also have exceptions that can be thrown so you can react accordingly. So, and this is how you basically use AWS JavaScript SDK to communicate to different AWS services. And in our case, we're using Cognito Identity Provider. Back in Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and install AWS SDK Client Cognito Identity Provider. Now let's go ahead and update the code to be able to interface with this SDK. So back in components, navigation.tsx, we're going to update that file. And this update is here just to have a link to have the settings page, right? So we can click on that link, right? And user can go to the settings page. Now let's go ahead and create that settings page. In the src app folder, let's go ahead and create a new folder called settings. And in this folder, let's go ahead and create a file called page.tsx. We're going to put the following code, and let's take a quick look at it. This is a pretty simple code, right? We basically have the settings page, and here the most important will be the settings form, which we will be creating shortly. We get a user using verify session function, and this function comes from del.ts file, which stands for data access level. We created this function earlier. So next, we basically have the navigation, right? And we have the link back to dashboard. And like I said, the meat of this page is settings form. Let's go ahead and create it. In the components folder, let's create a new file called settingsform.tsx. Let's go ahead and put the following code in this file. This code is a little bit long, so we're going to be explaining it. But first, we'll see the imports right here. We're going to be using useState from React because we're working from the forms. And we're also going to be importing a few actions like update profile, resend verification email, confirm email action, and update password action. So we're going to be importing this from the settings actions. This file does not exist yet, but those are actions that we're going to be using to update the information in Cognito using Cognito's SDK. Let's go ahead and create that file as well in a lib folder. Let's create the file called settingsactions.ts. In the settingsactions.ts file, we're going to put the following code. We have all the actions that we're going to be using to communicate to using Cognito SDK. So we're going to be basically looking at the settings form, right, and check how it connects to the settings action. But before we do that, let's actually not to forget to protect our settings page right here in a proxy.ts file, right? We have the protected pages, dashboard, and the tasks. And let's go ahead and add the protected page as settings as well. So now we're all set. Let's go back to our settingsform.ts. So if we actually scroll down all the way to our markup, right, we can see that basically all we have is just a form, right? This form will contain name, it will contain the email. We also will need to verify email because if we change the email, Cognito will actually send the verification code. So we'll need to be able to get that code and verify that email. And we also have a change password section here where user will be able to change password. And we're only going to display it if user does not have identities. We will add identities later to our user, but what it really means is that if the user is not signed in using Google, for example, right, then user has password in the Cognito and they can change it. However, if they use Google, right, there will be a property identities. It means user does not have a password, so we're not going to be displaying the change password form. Now let's scroll back to the top here and take a look at the code that will be basically managing these forms. So first we have a bunch of use state right here. All right, this use state will be managing the state of the confirmation code, whether we're loading, is password loading, resending, error, and success. Next function is handle change. So if anything changes, right, we set the error or clear the error. Next we have a handle submit function, and this handle submit function basically checks if submit button is clicked, right, and then it's gonna be using our actions, right, to update data in Cognito as well. First, we're gonna check if the confirmation code is submitted, and if it is, we're gonna be triggering confirm email action. Let's go and look at this action in our settings actions file. So we have this function confirm email action, and what we're gonna be doing here, we're gonna be using a Mongo client. And the reason we're going to be using Mongo because we have a field in a user if email verified true or false. So when email is verified, we need to update that field to set it to true. Next, we're going to get headers list, right, from headers and our user with a verify session function, and then obviously check if the user is there. And if everything is good, we're going to get an access token. So the way we can get an access token is from Auth or Better Auth, right? .api. That's the way to communicate with a Better Auth on the server side, because we're in a server action, and we'll use the function get access token, and we're going to put the provider as Cognito and then our headers. And this function will actually get the access token, but if access token expires, right, it will actually smartly refresh that token and get us the new token, because we also get a refresh token when we're doing Auth 2.0 flow. So next, we're going to be calling verify attribute command, right, on AWS Cognito SDK client, and we're going to be sending this command. And basically, this requires access token, and the attribute that we're going to be verifying will be email, and we'll be sending the code. Next, if the email is confirmed successfully, we're going to be using Mongo client. We're going to be connecting to the database, and then we basically going to be updating email verified to true. And here we're going to be returning success if everything goes well, or catch an error, and then in the finally close, we're going to be disconnecting from Mongo client, or rather from Mongo database using Mongo client. And here I'm actually using Mongo client. However, we installed Mongoose, and you can actually use this Mongoose ODM to do the same thing. I'm just showing you this code just to show you that you can do it in different ways. So this is how the email verification code will work. So let's jump back to our settings form. When we receive the response, right, from the confirm email action, which is going to set the loading to true, right? We'll set if it's success. We'll just show that the success message, right? Again, we'll update the user email verified to true. So now our backend and front end is consistent, right? We'll clear the confirmation code and remove the loading. Next up is the email and name, right? That's how we're going to be changing username and email. We will basically validate those fields in here. So we'll check if there is email, if there is username, right? We also can use regex to validate email. Obviously, if something goes wrong, we'll throw an error. And then we'll create an object called user attributes, which will be that name, that user input, and email will be email. Obviously, if we detect that that object is empty, we are just going to do nothing. We'll just remove the loading and return. And if user attributes contain actually user attribute, we'll call the update profile action. So let's go ahead to the definition of this function. And this basically function, again, going to be using Cognito identity provider client. And we're actually instantiating this Cognito identity provider client in the beginning of the settings actions file, and all we need to pass is our Cognito region. There are actually other credentials that we need to do, but we'll pick them up from our environment variables. So we will paste those environment variables when we are ready to go with the code, and I'll show you how to do them. So this Cognito, or rather AWS SDK library, can authenticate with AWS. But going back to update profile action, right, we're going to have this email and password passed to it, right? Again, we're going to use the MongoDB client because we're going to be updating the data in the database. So we're going to get const user, right? We're going to, again, get the user from the session. If there is no user, we'll throw unauthorized. We'll just create user attributes, and this is going to be actually an array. That's how AWS requires, or Cognito requires the attributes to be sent. So basically, we're going to create the new command, admin update user attributes command, and in this array, we'll have the name and the email. So in order to use this command, we'll need to specify Cognito user pool. We need to use the username. And as you remember, we added the username back in the beginning when we used the auth right here. So we, in Better Auth, we get additional information, username, from a user info response. Back in settings actions, right, we also will need the user attributes, obviously, because we are updating them. And we're just going to send the command to Cognito, right? And if everything is successful, and most importantly, if we are updating an email, we will use Mongo client, right, to update the information about user email in the database. So what we're going to do, we're going to set email data email, right, the email, the new email, and then we'll set the email verified to false, because when you're updating email in Cognito, it will automatically send the verification code to that email. Actually, Better Auth has its own mechanism of changing the email and sending the email verification. However, this won't work with a Cognito because we're using this Cognito as a third-party identity provider. The way the email verification works with a better auth if you're using email and password kind of authentication. So in our case, we will have to manually change information in the database to be consistent. So in a ways, better auth is actually working kind of against us here. So after we updated email and set email verified to false, we're just going to return the response. Everything is updated successfully. And if something goes wrong, we'll catch an error, rethrow it, and disconnect from the Mongo database. So back in a settings form, we're going to get the result. If everything goes well, we're going to create a result and we will update username. We can do that with update user method on auth client, right? We'll put the name, form data, whatever name the user input, because we're assuming everything went well here. Because if there is an error, right, we will have the catch statement. So, and then also we check if the email, right, if the email is not the same, meaning user updated the email, we will set the email verified to false on the user on the front end to be consistent with the back end. And again, we'll check the result and data status. If everything is good, we'll just display the message that the profile updated successfully. Otherwise, we'll display the error, and obviously we'll have a catch statement here to catch the error if the update profile action failed, and then finally we will set the loading to false. Next up is resend verification. So as I mentioned before, when you update the email, verification code is sent to the email, but what if user did not receive it, right? And so we need to account for that. So we'll create a form and then handler to resend the verification code. And here we're going to be basically, again, setting the error to null, success to null, setting our form basically, or messages on that form. And then we're going to use the resend verification email action. So let's go and look at how it works. So here, resend verification email action, we will get again the user from the verify session and the headers list, because we will need to get access token, and the same process, right? We'll get provider Cognito and get the headers, and then better auth will get us access token, and if it expires, it will use refresh token to get us a new valid access token. Then we're going to be using send method on the client, and the command will be get user attribute verification code command. It requires access token, and it requires the email that we're going to be basically using to resend that verification code, because Cognito also uses phone, right? It can be a phone here, then Cognito will text that verification code. But in our case, we're using the email. If everything goes well, right, we're going to return success, and if something goes wrong, we'll catch an error and rethrow that error. Back in the settings form, again, we'll just set success if everything goes well and clear the confirmation code. If something goes wrong, we will display an error and obviously set the resending false, meaning we're not going to have the spinner on the button. The final part of our user settings is basically handling the password change. And as I mentioned before, we can only handle this password when user does not have identities, right? We're going to show this code or the form only if the user logged in with their username and password and not with Google. So handle password change. Again, we're going to have set the password data right here, set error and set success, right? Going to do reset. And then we're going to have handle password submit function. And in this function, much like with the username or the user's name and password, we're going to do a little bit of a validation right here if the password match. And if everything goes well, we're going to do update password action. So let's go to definition real quick here. So the same process, we'll get the user, we'll check if there is user. If the user is there, we'll just do a quick check on the password right here, so at least the length is the same. You obviously can put some more validations, and then we're going to be using admin set user password command. It will require user pool, username, the password, and we're going to say that the permanent true, so we're going to be sending this password permanently. After that, I'm going to send the command. Again, if everything goes well, return the success. If something goes wrong, we're going to catch an error and return that or rethrow that error. Back in the settings form, right, we're going to, again, set success if everything went successful, but if something goes wrong, we're going to set the error and reset the password loading to false. Before spinning up the application and checking our code, there's a couple of things we actually need to do. So let's go ahead and add the identities to our user type first. This should fix the TypeScript error. However, we also need to add identities to our authentication, right? Better Auth configuration file in auth.ts, right? So there will be another additional field on the user called identities. It will be a type of string, but we don't really care much about them. All we have to do is to check if they exist. And then here in get user info, the user return right here, let's add identities property. And the final thing that we need to do is to authenticate our AWS SDK. And the way you can do it, you can actually go to Cognito, and in the IAM, you can create a user. And then when you create a user, right, you can assign that user permissions. And these permissions will let user access only to Cognito, for example, right? And then you can just go ahead and create the security credentials for this user with the access key and the access secret, and then you can use it, put them as environment variables in your code, right? However, there is another way of doing it. I have IAM Identity Center enabled, so basically I have this single sign-on into my different accounts, and what I can do, I can click on the access keys and just copy those keys and paste them into the CLI, which we're going to be doing. So let's go ahead and switch to the Visual Studio Code, and let's go ahead simply paste all these AWS credentials. Now we should be all set, and we can spin up the application with npm run dev. Let's go ahead, switch to the browser. We need to log out first, and as you remember, we have those cookies, so we actually need to get the identities. So let's go ahead and clear Better Auth state cookie right here, and also we're gonna go to our database. And in the database, we are going to go and have all this information right here, right? Account, tasks, and user. Let's go ahead and delete this so we can clear all this information. And then when we log in again, we will have the identities property. So let's go ahead and do just that. So we're going to click on Get Started. We'll be using the user Google sign in first to check if everything is working and if we can see the password. And we're logged in. And if we click right here on user icon, we can see the settings, right? That's the link that we created. So let's go to our settings page, and out of the bat, you can see that I do not have actually changed password section, right? Because I'm logged in with Google, but I also changed my Google email, right? It's a different email from a temp mail. So it's basically asking me to verify this email because that email is not verified in Cognito. So let's go ahead and check if resending verification email will work. Let's go and do that. And it looks like verification email is sent successfully. So I'm going to go to that temp mailbox, and I just got my verification code right here. And let me go ahead and copy this code, and then I can go ahead and paste it in here. Let's go ahead and save changes. And it looks like our email got verified. So we're all cool here. So obviously we can check if our name can be changed, right? So let's go ahead and change our name. We can put some like Alejandro Skin, and obviously click Save Changes. And as you can see, our name got updated successfully. And most importantly, here on the top, right, it changed right away, which means our information is in sync and everything is working great. And just like that, you can actually do the authentication, but just to check if the resetting password will work. So let's go ahead and log out. From here, we will actually need to log in as the user that has username and password. For that, I'm going to quickly clear the cookies because Cognito kind of still remembers my authentication with Google. So I'm going to go to Chrome settings right here under privacy and security, and just delete the browsing data in the last 15 minutes. That should do the trick. And then I'm going to also basically click the Get Started button. And now I'm getting redirected again to Cognito Managed UI. Let me put the user email. Next, we can do the password. I'll click Continue. We're prompted for MFA. Let's go ahead and do just that. And we're signed in as a different user that has username and password. So let's go ahead and go to the settings for that user. And as you can see, we can also have a section where we can change our password. Let's go ahead and change the password to make sure this functionality works. Let's put password right here, confirm password, and click on change password, and everything is working. Our password got changed. And this is how you can create a solid authentication for your Next.js application using Better Auth and Amazon Cognito. And if you would like to learn how to secure your API using Amazon Cognito and JWT Authentication, please check out Secure Your API with JWT Authentication step-by-step tutorial next.